Hi guys, today we're going to be starting our unit on Africa. Africa is a very large continent, and obviously there are a lot of individual cultures with individual histories and individual conflicts and values. But for the first couple days, we are going to be doing sort of an Africa overview and looking at some major historical events that affected the entire continent, as well as looking at the geography of the continent as a whole, because the regions are pretty large and spread across so many different countries. But then we will be digging into some specific countries, both through your presentations and a little bit through things that I'm going to be telling you, but mostly through presentations for this unit. And we'll talk more about the presentations on Friday. Tomorrow? Don't know what day it is. Anyways, for Africa, in order to really understand where Africa is today, we need to look at some history that is not the greatest history that's ever happened. So we are going to look at three ways in particular that Europeans and Americans have kind of, well, just done bad things in Africa, for lack of a better title. So here we go. Let's jump right in. Number one, slavery. This should be kind of a no-brainer. The transatlantic slave trade really had a huge impact on Africa. How could it not? So primarily what the transatlantic slave trade, for those of you who don't know, traders would transport slaves from Africa primarily to the Americas, North America and South America. We talked a little bit about the influence of slavery in South America as well. And this lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and we'll talk about what happens after that, after the slave trade becomes abolished. So 2/3 of the people who were taken as slaves were men, and they did this through kidnapping them from tribes, or various tribes would actually sell some of their people to the slave traders in order to gain money. Just consider the impact this would have on a society if 2/3, 2/3 of the people who are taken are men, but that obviously creates some disparity in gender balances, which definitely is going to affect their culture and things like that. So the effect of slavery in Africa obviously is big, but one of the big ways that it really kind of made things bad, if you will, is that the white traders would trade firearms for people. So this goes back to that people who would sell slaves to the traders, and in return they would get firearms. Now these are cultures that up until this point they haven't had guns and things. They still fight, but this is a new, very powerful form of warfare. And this created an imbalance of power between the countries on the west and then the more northern and eastern countries. So with this power imbalance, obviously there's going to be conflict that, if it was a little bit there before, obviously the death tolls and just the violence of that is going to increase with the introduction of firearms. Another way that slavery affected the cultures in Africa is that because so many men were taken as slaves, it put more responsibility on the women. But 6 to 7 million Black slaves were imported to the New World during the 18th century alone. So that is obviously a very large number. The picture on the right shows the concentration of where most of the slaves came from. You see, obviously, there are a lot of coastal tribes that were very affected, but also even getting across down into Madagascar and places like that. Here you have a map that shows some of the trade routes, which the thickness of the line, obviously more slaves there. So a lot of them being sent to Brazil, which is why you get such a much stronger African influence there. But also a lot up into Spanish America and the North American continent. All right, the second terrible thing that Europeans and Americans did in Africa, well, this one is actually mostly Europe. So yeah, colonization, here we go. All right, so after the slave trade became illegal, obviously there were a lot of people whose jobs were no longer viable. So slave trade becomes less profitable and colonization becomes the next best option. And they would do this through just outright aggression or trying to make diplomatic ties with some of the tribes there, but often those treaties and things would be interpreted differently between the colonizers and the people already living there. Sometimes countries would just straight up send in their militaries to take over and occupy a place. But then also, there were a lot of civilians who eventually just went and settled down in Africa, and we will talk about that, why that happened in a little bit too. Well, I guess we can talk about it now. So 3 factors that contributed to colonization, and I want you to also just check that map over there that shows kind of where the European powers mainly situated themselves. So economic factors, Africa had become a main source of raw materials. So throughout the slave trade, they realized that there were a lot of resources in Africa that in the white people's minds were free for the taking. And so in order to keep industry going in Europe, they tried to take things from Africa. And naturally, that's a lot easier if you are in control of the land in Africa. Also, there were a lot of political reasons. European powers were competing for dominance. And the main way that they decided to do that was to conquer other territories. Europe was settled, the Americas were pretty much settled, and so now they turned their eye towards Africa. The other social factor that contributed to the colonization of Africa was that European industrialization left a lot of people without work. So as machines become more efficient, you need fewer workers. And the surplus population of Europe, they were sort of exported. They were either sent to Africa sort of to find work, or they decided to go there on their own. Obviously, all of this European and American intervention in Africa is going to have a huge impact on the societies there. And it dramatically interrupted native ways of life and innovation. So a lot of people looked at Africa and they thought, oh, these people are savages, their culture is terrible, they aren't Christian, all of this kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is that those cultures were basically different. And it's difficult to actually say whether African cultures were less advanced or more advanced, maybe less technologically advanced than the European powers at the time. But when you have that much upheaval in your society, it really puts the brakes on innovation. The pictures that you see on the slides are of, some of you may recognize it, of Wakanda, because scholars throughout the years, and Marvel touches on it in Black Panther as well, people have tried to think of what might Africa be like today if the European and American powers hadn't interfered so dramatically with their cultures. What sorts of technology would they have invented? What kinds of cities would they have, societies? Because European powers were concerned that the frenzy for power would lead to wars, but there's also so much else that could have gone on that would not necessarily have been violent if Africa had been left to its own devices. Europe was really preoccupied with that idea of Africa might cause wars, either because the people or because of the different countries vying for power. And while they were competing for power, they didn't necessarily want to fight each other. So they did this thing called the Berlin West African Conference in November of 1886 to February of 1885, during which they came up with kind of 5 main ideas, and then the 6th one is just kind of a fact that they were also working on. But basically, the European powers who were trying to colonize Africa met together, and they decided these are the rules for how we are going to colonize Africa. Number 1, the first thing that they decided was that they were going to have a principle of notification, or notifying the other powers of a territorial annexation. What this means is when you take over a place in Africa, you have to tell the rest of the European colonizers that you have taken over that area, so we know it's yours. Number two, the principle of effective occupation to validate the annexations. This was what counts as taking over someplace. How do you know if you have colonized it or if you're just camping out in a specific region? Number three, freedom of trade in the Congo Basin. We'll talk about the Congo Basin on whenever we talk about geography. And basically, they said the Congo Basin is so important for movement and resources that we need to have freedom of trade in the Congo Basin. That can't belong exclusively to one person. You can't close off access to the Congo Basin, basically. Similarly, they said that they needed freedom of navigation on the Niger and Congo rivers. Once again, that also has to do with trade and the ability to move around and travel. They said that they had freedom of trade to all nations, that you couldn't close that off. Also, obviously, the slave trade is illegal, but they also said that they would make sure to also suppress the slave trade by land or sea. And see, this did not mean that they weren't taking advantage of the African people that they found, but it does mean that they weren't allowed to officially call anything slavery anymore. So that worked out well. Also, quick note on that, you might have noticed that there was nothing in there about actually communicating to people who were native to the land or people who were already there. There were no African people at that conference. And so naturally, that caused some confusion when the Europeans were actually trying to colonize Africa. So Europeans would go to the tribes and they would get them to sign these treaties, because this was one of the things that they came up with, that how do we know that a place is colonized? And to the Europeans, these treaties meant that Africans had signed away their land to the European powers. Sweet, done. However, to the Africans, and this might sound slightly familiar as to what happened in America with the Native Americans, but to the Africans, the treaties were merely diplomatic and commercial friendship treaties. So agreements that they would share resources, work the land together, and sort of split the profits that would be coming out of this this union, right? And so with the growing difficulties in trade, they tried, Africans tried to have intermediaries who would specifically communicate with the Europeans and things like that. It didn't work very well, surprise. And so inevitably, there came a point when Africa, they decided to fight back. And their military resistance was obviously different, because remember that the European powers actually have access to a lot of firepower, whereas the native tribes mostly have things that they have acquired through trading with the Europeans. And so their main method of warfare was guerrilla warfare, because military engagement never worked out very well for the native tribes because they didn't have the firepower for it. And they just didn't have the resources or the manpower to win against the Europeans, which is why they tried the guerrilla warfare. But even so, the Europeans were simply stronger. And that leads us to our third element of terrible things Europeans and Americans have done in Africa. This leads us to apartheid. It is not pronounced apartheid, it's apartheid. And this is an Afrikaans word, and we'll talk about its specific definition, but it comes from a word that basically means separated. And you can think of it sort of as segregation, but this primarily affected South Africa. So the official definition of apartheid is a system of institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa and Southwest Africa from 1948 until the early 1990s. So warfare did not go well. Europeans still had power, but coming into the 50s, etc., they realized they needed a little bit more of a system in certain parts to sort of quell some of this uprising. And they came up with this. So apartheid, this is a map of South Africa up in the top right-hand corner. And So South Africa, they came up with this idea of the Land Act, which reserved 80% of the land for the white people, which was by far the minority of the population. The Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, very European name, came up with this idea of separate development. So if we just separate everybody from each other, it'll be fine, right? Because that worked out so well in America. And so you'll see that the colored blotches on the map, they are near each other, but they're also separated themselves. There are pockets of where the native people lived, and they're separated further between their specific tribes. So it's not even just that all of the Black people have to stay in one area and all of the white people have to stay in another area. They're separated between tribe, and even within their tribe, they can't necessarily visit the other places unless they have special permission. So forced segregation of the Europeans and Africans by the all-white government in South Africa, restricting the land. So the Great Depression and World War II brought increasing economic woes to South Africa and convinced the government to strengthen its policies of racial segregation, right? They didn't want to, they were a little bit concerned about what the natives might do. And so we have to separate them before they band together and rise. You'll see these actual signs of things that were going on. One of them says, "Caution, beware of natives," which tells you a lot about how the white government and the white people sort of viewed the potential threat of the native people of South Africa. Non-whites even needed special government-issued passes to cross into white territory. Interracial marriages and relationships were illegal. That part is a lot less surprising since interracial marriage didn't become legal in the USA until 1967, which is not that long ago. But then also, non-whites could not participate in the government of South Africa, which had been taken over by the white people in colonization. I'm not sure how many of you know who Trevor Noah is. He is a comedian. He hosts The Daily Show. But he also wrote this very good book. It's an autobiography called Born a Crime. And he lived in South Africa during apartheid. If people found out that he had a white father, he could have been arrested. His mother could have been arrested, things like that. But he has this very good quote in that book about apartheid. And I'm going to read it to you. You can read along. But I want you to think about the climate of this country during this time period. He says, "Part of the effort to divide Black people was to make sure we were separated not just physically, but by language as well. In the Bantu schools, children were only taught in their home language. Zulu kids learned in Zulu, Tswana kids learned in Tswana. Because of this, we'd fall into the trap the government had set for us and fight amongst ourselves, believing that we were different. The genius of apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other. Apartheid is what it was. You separate people into groups and make them hate one another so you can run them all." So that concludes our flyby of some of the terrible things Europeans and Americans have done in Africa that have very significantly impacted culture and society throughout an entire continent. Usually it's a little bit ridiculous to look at one continent and sort of analyze it as a whole. But because of these things and some of the struggles that are shared throughout Africa, we can actually look at these things as a whole and then start to dig into how they appear or how they've impacted various countries. So on that note, I hope you guys have a good day. Make sure that you fill out the questions after this video and hang in there.